My name is Cassidy Mitchell, and I'm 22 years old. The phone call came on college move-in day, my mother's voice shrill with panic, begging for money like I was some kind of ATM machine. I listened to her sob for maybe 10 seconds before I hung up without saying a word. My father called back immediately, then my sister, then my mother again from a different number. I blocked them all and went back to unpacking my dorm room with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They took everything from me 6 months ago, $45,000 that I'd saved and inherited, money meant for my education, and they handed it to my older sister for a wedding that lasted one day. Now they wanted more, and the audacity of it made me laugh out loud in that empty dorm room. How did I get here? Let me take you back to where it all started. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you've ever dealt with family drama or felt like the forgotten child, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this. And please subscribe because trust me, you'll want to hear how this whole thing plays out. The next part gets even more unbelievable, so stick around. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I always knew something was off about how my parents treated me, compared to my sister Bethany. She's 4 years older than me, and from the moment I was old enough to understand family dynamics, I could see the difference in how they looked at her versus how they looked at me. My father Gerald worked as an insurance broker, pulling in decent money, and my mother Marlene worked part-time as a nurse at the local clinic. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either, which made their choices even harder to understand. When Bethany wanted ballet lessons at age 7, she got enrolled in the most expensive studio in town, with the fancy recital costumes and the whole production. When I asked for the same thing 3 years later, my mother patted my head and said we couldn't afford it, then handed me a stack of library books about dancing instead. I learned early that asking for things only led to disappointment, so I stopped asking. The pattern continued through our entire childhood in ways both big and small. Bethany got a brand new car when she turned 16, a cute little sedan with a bow on top that my parents surprised her with on her birthday. When I turned 16, they handed me the keys to Bethany's old bicycle because she didn't need it anymore now that she had a car. My father said it would build character and teach me the value of hard work. Bethany got spring break trips to Florida with her friends, funded entirely by our parents who worried she'd miss out on important social experiences. I got permission to pick up extra shifts at the local diner where I'd been working since I was 15, saving every penny because I knew college would be my only escape route from this dynamic. The excuses were always the same, delivered with this casual indifference that hurt worse than outright cruelty. Bethany needs it more. You'll understand when you're older. Your sister has different requirements. Family resources have to be allocated carefully. Looking back now, I realize they were training me to expect less, to make myself smaller, to accept that my dreams mattered less than Bethany's comfort. I coped by throwing myself into academics with a intensity that sometimes scared even me. I became a straight-A student, not because I loved school, but because good grades were free, and they were mine, something nobody could take away or give to my sister instead. I joined the debate team and became captain by junior year, winning regional competitions that my parents never attended because they conflicted with Bethany's college visits or social events. I volunteered at the homeless shelter every weekend, partly because I genuinely wanted to help, and partly because it kept me out of the house where I didn't have to watch my parents dote on Bethany's every mundane accomplishment. The diner job started the summer I turned 15. Bussing tables and learning how to smile at rude customers who left terrible tips. I saved everything, hiding cash in a shoebox under my bed at first, until I was old enough to open my own bank account. My grandmother Dorothy, my father's mother, was the only person who seemed to see what was happening. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings and tell me I was special, that I was going to do amazing things, that education would set me free. When she passed away during my junior year of high school, I cried for 3 days straight, mourning the only family member who'd ever made me feel seen. Then the will was read, and I discovered that grandmother Dorothy had left me $30,000, specifically designated for educational expenses. The lawyer explained that she'd structured it carefully so my parents couldn't touch it, that the money would go directly into an account in my name when I turned 17. I remember my mother's face going tight when the lawyer said that, and my father asked multiple questions about whether the will could be contested, but Dorothy had been meticulous. That money felt like a lifeline thrown to me from beyond the grave, proof that at least one person in my family had believed I deserved a future. I added my own savings to it over the next year and a half, the wages from countless shifts at the diner where I smiled through grease burns and handsy customers and the overwhelming smell of burnt coffee. By the time I was ready to apply to colleges, I had $45,000 saved. A combination of Dorothy's gift and my own blood and sweat. It felt like freedom in numerical form, like a ticket to a life where I wouldn't always come second. The first warning sign came during my senior year, when Bethany announced her engagement to Trevor Ashford, a mediocre finance bro she'd been dating for 18 months. My parents threw an engagement party that I wasn't consulted about, renting out a whole restaurant and inviting everyone they'd ever met to celebrate their golden child's upcoming nuptials. I came home from my shift at the diner to find the house empty and a note on the counter telling me there was leftover pizza in the fridge because they'd be out late at Bethany's party. They hadn't even thought to invite me, their other daughter, to the celebration. I ate cold pizza alone in the kitchen and told myself it didn't matter, that soon it'd be gone anyway. My mother started making comments after that, little remarks dropped into conversation like poison and honey. Family should help family, she'd say, while folding Bethany's wedding magazines. Big events require everyone to pitch in. Your sister only gets one wedding. I ignored the hints because I was focused on college acceptance letters, on the future I was building brick by brick with my grades and my savings, and my determination to escape. When the acceptance letter came from State University, a prestigious school with an excellent social work program, I felt my heart actually soar in my chest. It'd done it. It'd gotten in. With my partial academic scholarship and my saved money, I could actually afford it. I could leave home and build something that was entirely mine. I brought the letter to my parents during dinner, my hands shaking with excitement as I laid it on the table between their plates. It expected something, maybe not a party like Bethany would have gotten, but at least a smile or a congratulations, or a moment of pride. My father glanced at it and said, "That's nice, honey," without even putting down his fork. My mother looked at the letter for maybe 3 seconds before her face did this thing where it closed off completely, and then she turned to Bethany and asked if she'd decided on flowers for the centerpieces yet. Just like that, my biggest achievement became invisible, less important than wedding decorations. I picked up the acceptance letter and went to my room, and I should have known then that something bad was coming, should have seen the way they couldn't even pretend to care about my future, when Bethany's perfect day was on the horizon. Bethany's wedding consumed our household like a wildfire eating through dry grass, leaving no room for anything or anyone else. This happened about 6 months before I was supposed to start college, and suddenly every conversation revolved around venue options and dress fittings, and which cousin would be offended if they weren't invited. Bethany wanted a dream wedding, the kind she'd been pinning on Pinterest boards since she was 12, and she approached it with the entitlement of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. The venue she chose cost $35,000 alone. Some converted barn an hour outside the city with string lights and exposed beams and a waiting list that my parents somehow got her on through connections. The dress was another $8,000 from a boutique where they served champagne to brides and treated shopping like a religious experience. Then there was the destination bachelorette party in Miami that Bethany insisted she needed, because all her friends were doing destination parties, and she couldn't possibly settle for something local. I watched the costs pile up from the sidelines, seeing my parents' faces grow more stressed with each new expense, catching the tail end of hushed arguments about credit cards and payment plans. 4 months before I was supposed to leave for college, things came to a head at a family dinner that I'd actually bothered to attend. We were sitting around the table eating my mother's dry pot roast, when Bethany started talking about how she wanted to upgrade the floral arrangements because the seasonal flowers weren't special enough. My father made some comment about the budget being stretched thin, and that's when Bethany turned to look at me with this calculating expression that made my stomach drop. She said, so casually, that maybe I didn't really need to go to such an expensive school, that community college was just as good for people who weren't sure what they wanted to do with their lives anyway. Trevor, who had barely spoken to more than 5 times, jumped in to agree that community college was a smart financial choice, and there was no shame in starting small. I sat there with my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, genuinely unable to believe what I was hearing. My parents said nothing, just exchanged this look across the table that I couldn't quite read, but that made all my instincts scream danger. I defended myself, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended, saying I'd worked for 3 years to save money, and I'd earned a partial scholarship, and this wasn't up for discussion. Bethany laughed this tinkling little laugh she does when she wants to sound charming but is actually being cruel, and she said I was being selfish for not thinking about family needs. That was the first time anyone had ever called me selfish to my face, and it hit me like a slap. My mother jumped in then, her voice taking on this martyred tone, talking about how she and my father had sacrificed so much raising both of us, how Bethany only gets married once, and it's important for the family to make it special. I shot back that I only go to college once too, that my education was just as important as Bethany's party, and the word party came out with more venom than id meant to show. My father's face went dark at that, and he told me in this cold voice that I was being disrespectful and ungrateful. The argument escalated until I threw my napkin on my plate and walked out, leaving them all sitting there in that dining room that suddenly felt like enemy territory. The manipulation campaign intensified after that dinner, like they'd all decided on a strategy, and were executing it with military precision. My mother started guilt-tripping me every chance she got, bringing up random memories from my childhood, and tallying up how much she claimed they'd spent on me over the years. She'd mention the cost of my braces while I was brushing my teeth, or calculate the price of all my school supplies while I was trying to study, turning my entire existence into a debt I apparently owed. My father suddenly discovered boxes of old bills in the garage, itemized expenses from when I was a baby, and he'd leave them on the kitchen counter where I'd see them, receipts for diapers and formula, and doctor visits like he was building a legal case. Bethany took to social media, posting vague status updates about family members who don't support each other, and how sad it is when people forget where they came from. Her friends would comment with sad face emojis and supportive messages, none of them knowing the full story but all of them contributing to this narrative where I was the villain. At family gatherings, my extended family started treating me differently, cooler, and more distant, and I realized my parents had been talking to them, spreading their version of events where I was the ungrateful daughter, refusing to help with her sister's special day. My Aunt Judith, my mother's sister who had always thought liked me, cornered me at my grandmother's memorial service, and asked why I was ruining my sister's happiness. She said it with this disappointed look on her face, like it'd personally offended her, and I was so shocked I couldn't even formulate a response. The isolation was deliberate and effective, cutting me off from family support piece by piece, until I felt like I was standing alone against all of them. 2 months before college was supposed to start, my parents sat me down for what they called a serious financial discussion. They presented it like a business proposal, asking me to lend them $20,000 for the wedding, with the promise that they'd pay me back before I needed it for tuition. They had this whole speech prepared about family obligations and how money shouldn't come between people who love each other. They promised on everything holy that the money would be returned in time, that they just needed to bridge a temporary gap, that I could trust them because they were my parents, and parents always want what's best for their children. I said no. The word came out flat and final, and I watched both their faces change in real time. I explained as calmly as I could that the money was for my education, that Id worked incredibly hard for it, that grandmother Dorothy had specifically left it to me for college, and I wasn't going to betray that trust. My father's face went from pleading to angry in the space of a heartbeat, and he asked me if I understood what they'd done for me, after all they'd sacrificed. How dare I refuse to help when family needed me? My mother started crying, these manipulative tears that she could turn on and off like a faucet, saying she couldn't believe she'd raised such a selfish daughter. I stood my ground, even though my whole body was shaking, told them my answer was final, and left the house. I couldn't stay there anymore, couldn't breathe in that atmosphere of guilt and manipulation, so I called my friend Harper Green and asked if I could crash at her place for a while. Harper's mom, Linda, answered the phone and told me to come immediately, that their door was always open, and I packed a bag and left my childhood home, not knowing it would be months before I'd voluntarily return. 2 months crawled by with me, living at Harper's house and my parents in radio silence, which should have been my first clue that something was brewing. Then out of nowhere, they called and asked me to come to dinner, their voices warm and apologetic in a way that made me suspicious but also desperately hopeful. They said they'd been wrong to ask me for money, that they'd had time to think about what really mattered, that they wanted to make things right before I left for college. I wanted to believe them so badly that I ignored every instinct, screaming that this was a trap. Harper warned me to be careful, and Linda offered to come with me, but I said no because some pathetic part of me still wanted my parents to love me, still thought maybe they'd finally seen me as something other than a resource to exploit. I drove to the house on a Tuesday evening, my heart doing this painful, hopeful thing in my chest, wanting this to be real reconciliation, even though experience should have taught me better. The dinner was perfect in a way that should have been a red flag, my mother cooking all my favorite foods, and my father actually asking about my plans for college, with what seemed like genuine interest. They asked about my major and my dorm assignment, and whether I'd thought about joining any clubs, normal parent questions that I'd been starving for my entire life. Bethany wasn't there, which made the whole thing feel more intimate, like maybe this was actually about me for once. My mother even baked apple pie, my favorite dessert that she hadn't made in years, and watching her cut me a slice made my eyes sting with stupid, grateful tears. We ate and talked and it felt almost normal, almost like a real family, and I let my guard down in a way I hadn't in months. After dinner, we moved to the living room, and that's when they brought up the financial documents, saying they wanted to help me make sure everything was organized before I left for school. My father said he had experience with financial planning through his insurance work, and he could review my accounts to make sure I was maximizing interest rates and not missing any opportunities. My mother chimed in that she could help me go through all my paperwork and create a filing system so nothing would get lost during the chaos of moving to campus. It seemed helpful and parental and exactly what I'd always wished they would do, taking an active, supportive interest in my life instead of just Bethany's. I was so desperate for their approval that I didn't question it, didn't think about why they suddenly cared so much about my financial organization. I gave them access to my account information, handed over statements and passwords, and all the documentation of my $45,000. They said they'd look everything over that evening and we could go through their recommendations together the next day. My father insisted on keeping all the documents overnight so he could make detailed notes, and I agreed because I wanted to trust them, wanted this reconciliation to be real so badly that I made myself blind to the obvious setup. 3 days went by before I thought to check my bank account, 3 days of feeling hopeful and happy that maybe things were finally changing with my family. I logged in on Friday morning while eating breakfast at Harper's house, just a routine check to see the balance before I transferred some money between accounts. The number that came up made no sense at first, my brain unable to process what my eyes were seeing. $247.83. That was the total balance where there should have been $45,000. I refreshed the page thinking it was a glitch, that the website was broken, or showing the wrong account. The number stayed the same. I called the bank with hands that shook so hard I could barely hold the phone, and the customer service representative confirmed what I already knew but couldn't accept. A legal withdrawal of $44,752.17 had been made 3 days ago by a joint account holder. I told them there was no joint account holder, that this was my account alone, and the representative pulled up the paperwork showing that my parents had been added as joint holders when I was 17. I didn't remember signing anything like that, but the representative said they had my signature on file from 2 years ago, some form I'd apparently signed thinking it was routine account maintenance. They'd used old paperwork from before I was legally an adult, had positioned themselves as joint holders, and waited until the perfect moment to strike. I hung up the phone and threw up in Harper's bathroom, my whole body rejecting the reality of what had happened. Linda drove me to my parents' house even though I was in no state to confront anyone, but the rage was overriding the shock, and I needed answers immediately. I pounded on the door until my mother answered, her face showing no surprise at all, just this resigned look, like she'd been expecting me. I pushed past her into the living room where my father sat reading the newspaper like it was a normal Friday morning, like he hadn't just stolen his daughter's entire future the day before. My voice came out as a scream when I asked them what they'd done, where my money had gone, how they could possibly think this was okay. My mother had the audacity to look annoyed by my reaction, telling me to calm down and stop being so dramatic because they'd simply borrowed the money temporarily. My father folded his newspaper carefully and explained in this patronizing voice that the wedding was in 3 weeks and that had no other choice, that family helps family in times of need. I screamed that it was theft, that they'd stolen my college fund and my grandmother's legacy and my entire future, and my mother actually rolled her eyes at that. She said they'd pay me back in 6 months after they'd recovered financially from the wedding expenses, that I was overreacting and making everything about myself, when this was supposed to be Bethany's special time. That's when Bethany herself walked in from the kitchen holding a cup of coffee, and the look on her face told me she'd known about this the whole time, had maybe even been part of planning it. I turned on her with all the fury of someone who'd been betrayed by their entire family, asking if she knew they were going to steal from me, if she'd been okay with destroying my future for her party. Bethany set down her coffee cup and looked at me with this expression of complete indifference, shrugging her shoulders as she said she deserved a perfect wedding, and I'd have plenty of time to save up more money since I was young. The dismissiveness of it broke something in me, the casual cruelty of reducing years of my work and my dead grandmother's gift to nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. I threatened to call the police right then, to report them for theft and fraud and whatever else I could think of, but my father stood up and told me in this cold, deadly voice that I'd given them account access legally, so they'd done nothing wrong in the eyes of the law. He said I could try to make trouble but it would only hurt me in the long run, that every family member would know I'd tried to have my own parents arrested, that I'd be completely cut off and alone. My mother jumped in with her usual guilt tactics, telling me not to be dramatic and that family helps family, and didn't I understand they'd always intended to pay me back. Bethany added that maybe I should have worked harder and saved more if I wanted to be independent. That it was sad I was so obsessed with money that I couldn't be happy for her. Trevor walked in then, having let himself in the back door, and he actually laughed when he saw me crying and furious. He said maybe this would teach me a life lesson about not being so uptight about finances, that I should learn to go with the flow like normal people. I looked at all four of them standing there, these people who were supposed to love me and protect me, and I saw clearly for the first time that I meant nothing to them beyond what I could provide. The breakdown that followed was complete and total, my body shaking with sobs while they all stood there looking vaguely uncomfortable, but mostly annoyed that I was making such a scene over what they clearly saw as their rightful due. The final blow came when I said I wouldn't come to the wedding, that they couldn't force me to watch them celebrate with my stolen money. My mother's face went hard as stone, and she told me that if I didn't attend the wedding and smile and play the role of supportive sister, I would no longer be their daughter. My father added that they'd already told all our relatives that I'd volunteered the money to help Bethany, that everyone thought I was being generous and supportive, and if I tried to contradict that story, it'd be the one who looked crazy and vindictive. The trap was complete and perfect, isolating me from any possible support system, painting me as the villain if I tried to tell the truth, and leaving me with no legal recourse, because technically they hadn't done anything illegal. They'd simply outmaneuvered me using my own desperate desire for their approval against me. I left that house knowing I'd never really have parents again, that these people were strangers who happened to share my DNA, and that I was utterly alone in a way I'd never experienced before in my entire 20 years of life. I attended Bethany's wedding 3 weeks later like a ghost moving through someone else's nightmare, present in body but completely absent in spirit. I had no real choice despite my threats to boycott, because they'd backed me so thoroughly into a corner that refusing would have meant losing what little family connection remained and being branded as the monster who ruined her sister's special day. The wedding was everything Bethany had dreamed of and everything that made me want to scream, a $45,000 spectacle funded entirely by my stolen future. The venue looked like something out of a magazine, with those exposed beams and string lights that Bethany had obsessed over, tables decorated with elaborate centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent would have been at school. There were ice sculpture fountains pouring champagne, a 7-tier cake that required its own table and lighting, a live band for the ceremony, and a DJ for the reception because apparently one source of music wasn't enough. The bar was premium and open, meaning unlimited top-shelf alcohol for 200 guests who had no idea they were drinking my college education. I stood in the back during the ceremony wearing a dress I'd borrowed from Harper, because I couldn't afford to buy anything new, watching Bethany float down the aisle in her $8,000 gown, with our father looking proud enough to burst. Nobody seemed to notice or care that I was there, which was fine because I felt like I was watching all of this from underwater, muffled and distant and unreal. The reception was worse because I had to sit at the family table and pretend everything was fine, while relatives congratulated my parents on throwing such a beautiful wedding. People kept coming up to me with these knowing smiles, telling me how generous I was to contribute to my sister's special day, and I had to smile and nod, because the alternative was causing the scene my parents had threatened me against. The worst moment came during the toasts, when Bethany's maid of honor gave this gushing speech about family love, and mentioned my generous contribution to making this day perfect. The entire room erupted in applause, 200 people clapping for my supposed generosity, while I sat there feeling like I might throw up all over the white tablecloth. After the toast, relatives swarmed me with congratulations and praise for being such a good sister, patting my shoulder and telling me that family is everything, and I'd done such a beautiful thing. Nobody knew the truth, that I hadn't contributed anything willingly, that every dollar they were celebrating had been stolen from me through manipulation and legal trickery. I smiled until my face hurt and accepted their praise because what else could I do? Stand up and announce that my parents were thieves, and my sister was complicit in destroying my future. Trevor's family was there in force, his parents and siblings and extended relatives who looked at my family with this subtle condescension that suggested they thought we were beneath them socially. Trevor's brother Brock got drunk early and made loud comments about at least someone in our family having ambition, gesturing at Bethany in her ridiculous dress, while looking pointedly at me in my borrowed outfit. The implication was clear, that Bethany had value because she'd snagged Trevor, and I was just the sad little sister with no prospects and no future worth mentioning. The evening dragged on forever, course after course of expensive food that tasted like ash in my mouth, dance after dance of carefully choreographed joy that I couldn't participate in. I watched my $45,000 get consumed by people who didn't know and wouldn't care that they were eating my dreams, saw it evaporate in the fireworks display at midnight that Bethany had insisted on, despite the additional $10,000 cost. The whole spectacle was grotesque in its excess. Every detail, screaming, "Look how much money we spent. Look how special this day is. Look how important Bethany must be to deserve all this." I kept drinking water and wishing it was something stronger. But I didn't trust myself to drink alcohol because the anger simmering under my forced smile felt like it might explode if I loosened my control even slightly. The breaking point came near the end of the reception, when I escaped to the bathroom for a moment of peace away from all the false congratulations and pitying looks. I was standing at the sink, trying to compose myself when Bethany stumbled in, clearly drunk on the premium champagne my money had bought. She saw me in the mirror and this nasty smile spread across her face, the mask of sweet bride falling away to reveal the entitled brat underneath. She said I should actually thank her for this. That taking my college money had given me a real reason to work hard instead of coasting on grandmother's handout and my own mediocre savings. She said maybe now, I'd learn what real struggle felt like, and it would build my character, the way our parents had always tried to teach me. The slap came before I even knew I was going to do it, my palm connecting with her perfectly made-up face with a crack that echoed off the bathroom tiles. Bethany screamed like I'd stabbed her, her hand flying to her cheek while tears ruined her expensive mascara, and within seconds my mother burst through the door demanding to know what happened. Bethany sobbed that I'd attacked her, that I was jealous and horrible, and had hit her for no reason, and my mother didn't even look at me before deciding I was in the wrong. She wrapped her arms around Bethany and glared at me with more hatred than I'd ever seen directed at me before, telling me I'd always been jealous of my sister, and now I'd shown my true colors by getting violent at her wedding. My father appeared next, summoned by the commotion, and he took one look at the situation and grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. He marched me out of that bathroom and through the reception hall while people stared and whispered, walked me all the way to the parking lot without saying a word. Only when we were outside did he tell me in this deadly quiet voice that I needed to leave before I ruined everything completely, that I was an embarrassment and a disappointment, and he should have known I'd find a way to make this day about myself. I wanted to scream the truth at him, wanted to tell every single person at that wedding what they'd done to me, but I was so tired and so broken that I just got in Harper's car where she'd been waiting to drive me home, and left my sister's wedding reception without looking back. The ride back to Harper's house was silent, except for my ragged breathing, the tears that had been building all night finally breaking through now that I was away from all those judging eyes. Harper didn't try to comfort me with empty words, just drove and occasionally reached over to squeeze my hand, letting me fall apart without making me explain or justify my grief. When we got back to her house, Linda was waiting up despite the late hour, and she took one look at my face before pulling me into a hug that broke something loose in my chest. I cried in her arms like a child, mourning not just the money but the family I'd always wanted and never had, the parents who should have protected me, but chose my sister's party over my entire future. Linda held me, and let me sob until I had nothing left, until I was empty and exhausted and ready to sleep for 1,000 years. That night in Harper's guest room, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how I was supposed to build a life from nothing, how I could possibly afford college when I had $247 to my name in tuition bills coming due in 2 months. The wedding was over. Bethany had her perfect day, and I was left with ashes and rage, and the growing certainty that I would never forgive them for this, not ever, not for any reason that might come in the future. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in Harper's guest room with 8 weeks until college started, and nothing but determination keeping me from giving up entirely. Linda found me at her kitchen table with my laptop open, frantically searching for emergency student loans and last-minute scholarships, my face still puffy from the previous night's crying but my jaw set with new resolve. She sat down across from me with 2 cups of coffee and told me we were going to figure this out together, that I wasn't alone, even though my parents had tried their hardest to make me feel that way. We spent that first week creating an emergency plan, Linda using her legal knowledge to explore every possible option for funding my education. The picture was grim but not impossible. I could cover first semester with emergency student loans if I applied immediately, and my existing partial scholarship would help, but I still needed money for housing deposits, textbooks, meal plans, and basic supplies that added up to thousands of dollars I didn't have. Linda helped me calculate that if I could save $3,000 in the next 8 weeks, I could scrape by for first semester and figure out the rest later. $3,000 in 8 weeks meant I needed to make over $375 per week after taxes, which was impossible with just my diner job. That's when I went into what Harper started calling my hustle mode, taking on every job I could physically manage without completely destroying my health. I kept my morning shift at the diner from 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, working breakfast and lunch rushes and living on coffee and stolen bites of toast. In the afternoons, from 2 until 6, I started a dog walking service, taking on every client I could find through neighborhood apps and word of mouth. I'd run between houses with sometimes 4 or 5 dogs at once, managing leashes and personalities and trying not to get pulled over by the larger breeds. Then, from 7 at night until midnight, I worked at a 24-hour convenience store, standing behind bulletproof glass and selling cigarettes and lottery tickets to an endless parade of night shift workers and insomniacs. The schedule was absolutely brutal, leaving me maybe 4 hours for sleep if I was lucky, and didn't count the time needed for showering and traveling between jobs. I lost 15 pounds in the first 3 weeks because I forgot to eat or was too exhausted to bother, surviving on energy drinks and granola bars, and the occasional meal that Harper would force me to sit down and consume. My body started breaking down in small ways, my feet developing blisters that became permanent calluses, my eyes constantly red and dry from lack of sleep, my hands shaking from too much caffeine and not enough rest. Harper and Linda watched me destroy myself with this schedule and tried to get me to slow down, but I couldn't, because every dollar I didn't earn was another piece of my future slipping away. In those 8 weeks, I became a machine focused on one single goal, and everything else faded to background noise that didn't matter compared to saving enough money to get to campus. Small victories started accumulating in week 5 when I discovered an emergency grant for first-generation college students, which I technically qualified for because neither of my parents had completed their bachelor degrees. The application required an essay about overcoming adversity, and I wrote about growing up as the overlooked child, without mentioning the theft because I didn't want pity or questions. The grant came through 2 weeks later, $3,500 that felt like winning the lottery, and I cried in the convenience store bathroom during my break because finally something had gone right. I found a used textbook exchange online, where students sold their old books for a fraction of retail price, and I contacted my future professors to get book lists early so I could start hunting for deals. An alumni mentor named Patricia Holmes reached out through the University Connection program and offered me her old mini fridge and microwave, saving me another $300 I'd budgeted for those items. My assigned roommate, someone named Sloan Patterson, seemed willing to split costs on storage containers and other shared items based on our email exchanges. Every small victory felt massive because I was building my future from literally nothing, creating opportunity out of the wreckage my family had left behind. By week 7, I'd managed to scrape together enough for first semester tuition through loans, my housing deposit, the smallest possible meal plan, and basic supplies like sheets and towels and toiletries. I was still short on having any kind of emergency fund, which terrified me because one unexpected expense could derail everything. But I decided to risk it, because waiting another semester would feel like letting my parents win. Harper threw me a small going-away party the weekend before I left. Just her and Linda and a few close friends who'd supported me through the worst summer of my life. Linda's gift was $500 in grocery store gift cards with a note that said for essentials and emergencies. And I hugged her so hard, I probably bruised her ribs while crying grateful tears into her shoulder. She'd been more of a parent to me in 8 weeks than my own parents had been in 20 years. The night before I left for college, I packed everything I owned into a single suitcase and one backpack, shocked by how little I actually had after 2 decades of life. Most of my childhood belongings were still at my parents' house, but I'd rather start over with nothing than go back there and risk seeing their faces. I sat in Harper's guest room and wrote a letter to my parents that I had no intention of sending, pouring out all the rage and hurt and betrayal onto paper just to get it out of my system. The letter said things like, "You stole my money but gave me clarity about who you really are, and I know now that I can never trust you with anything that matters to me, and don't contact me unless it's to apologize and repay every cent you stole." Writing it felt cathartic even though I knew they'd never read it, and after I finished I tore it into tiny pieces and threw it away because they didn't deserve my words or my energy. That night I slept peacefully for the first time in months, exhausted but satisfied that I'd done everything humanly possible to make college happen despite their best efforts to destroy my future. Linda drove me to campus on move-in day, the 3-hour drive passing in a blur of nervous excitement and terror about what came next. The university was everything I'd dreamed about during those endless shifts and sleepless nights. Beautiful old buildings mixed with modern facilities, students everywhere looking eager and hopeful, and ready for their futures to begin. We found Morrison Hall, where I'd been assigned to room 314, a decent-sized double on the third floor with windows overlooking the main quad. My roommate Sloane was already there when we arrived, her side of the room set up like a Pinterest board with matching bedding and decorative pillows and fairy lights strung along her wall. Her parents had clearly brought her stuff in a U-Haul truck, based on the sheer volume of belongings, bins and boxes and furniture that must have cost thousands of dollars to accumulate. I walked in with my single suitcase and backpack, and Sloane's eyes widened slightly before she covered it with a bright smile and introduced herself as if she didn't notice the massive disparity in our situations. I told her I was going for a minimalist lifestyle, which was technically true if you defined minimalist as having no other options, and she seemed to accept that explanation without prying further. Linda helped me unpack my meager belongings, hanging up the 5 outfits I owned, and setting up the mini fridge and microwave that Patricia had donated, making my side of the room look as homey as possible given how little I had to work with. Sloane's parents were friendly in that wealthy, oblivious way, asking me questions about my major and my hometown, while clearly assuming I came from a similar background to their daughter. I deflected and smiled and tried not to feel bitter about the fact that Sloane's parents had rented a U-Haul for her stuff while mine had stolen my future, because that bitterness wouldn't help me survive what came next. After Linda left with promises to call every week and come visit when she could, I was alone in my new room with my new roommate, terrified and excited, and desperately hoping I could make this work. That's when I made the catastrophic mistake of adjusting my phone settings to connect to the campus Wi-Fi. And in the process, I accidentally unblocked my parents' numbers. I didn't realize I'd done it until 3 missed call notifications popped up on my screen, all from numbers I'd specifically blocked 2 months ago. My stomach dropped seeing those notifications, my first instinct to block them again immediately, but some sick curiosity made me hesitate. Before I could decide what to do, my phone started ringing with Mom Cell displayed across the screen, and my hand moved, almost without my permission to answer it. My mother's voice came through hysterical and sobbing, screaming my name like I'd risen from the dead, telling me they'd been trying to reach me, and thank God I'd finally answered. I stood in the middle of my dorm room with Sloane, pretending not to listen while arranging her desk supplies, and I asked my mother in the coldest voice I could manage what she possibly wanted from me now. The panic that poured through the phone was almost impressive in its desperation, my mother talking so fast I could barely understand her, while my father shouted in the background trying to get his own words in. They were in financial trouble, real trouble this time, with credit cards maxed out and mortgage payments missed, and apparently my father's car was being repossessed. My mother kept saying they needed help, that this was an emergency, that they were going to lose the house if they couldn't come up with $15,000 immediately. My father grabbed the phone at some point and demanded to know if I could take out student loans to help them, because I was in college now, so I had access to money they didn't. The audacity of it left me speechless for a solid 10 seconds, my brain struggling to process that they were actually asking me to go into debt to save them from the consequences of stealing from me and overspending on my sister's ridiculous wedding. I started laughing, and it was real laughter too. Not the bitter kind, but genuine amusement at the sheer insanity of what they were asking. My mother's voice went sharp, asking why I was laughing when this was serious, and that just made me laugh harder until I was nearly crying with it. I asked them if they were actually calling me for money, me, the daughter they'd stolen from 3 months ago, and my father had the nerve to say that I owed them because they were my parents. That stopped my laughter cold, and I told them in a voice I barely recognized as my own, that I owed them nothing, that they'd stolen $45,000 from me to fund a party, and now they expected me to bail them out of the debt they'd created. My mother tried to interrupt with excuses about how they'd had no choice, and Bethany deserved her special day, and I talked right over her, saying I was standing in a dorm room I could barely afford because they'd robbed me. Bethany's voice joined the chaos in the background, telling them to make me understand that this was a real emergency, and hearing her voice after everything Shed said at the wedding made something in me snap completely. I unleashed everything I'd been holding back for months, telling them exactly what I thought of their choices and their priorities and their complete failure as parents. I said they'd chosen ice sculptures and champagne fountains over my education, that they'd lied and manipulated and stolen and destroyed any chance of a relationship with me. I told them I'd worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night all summer, while they were probably enjoying their post-wedding relaxation, that I'd lost weight and aged years and nearly broken myself trying to salvage what they'd destroyed. My father tried to use his authority voice, the one that used to make me obey when I was a child, telling me that I would help them, or I was no longer their daughter. I told him I'd stopped being their daughter the moment they chose Bethany's decorations over my future, And the silence that followed that statement felt like a physical weight pressing through the phone connection. My mother made one last attempt at guilt, her voice breaking as she said they were going to lose the house, and didn't I care at all about the home I grew up in. I told her that Bethany and Trevor could take them in, since they loved spending my money so much. And then I hung up without waiting for a response. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone, and I immediately blocked their numbers again, this time double and triple checking to make sure it worked properly. When I looked up, Sloane was staring at me with wide eyes, having witnessed the entire confrontation, and I realized I'd just had a complete emotional breakdown in front of my new roommate on the first day of college. I expected judgment or questions or awkwardness, but instead, Sloane just offered me chocolate from her expensive snack stash and asked if I wanted to talk about it. That small gesture of kindness from a virtual stranger broke through my anger, and I ended up crying again, but these were different tears than before. Angry tears, instead of sad ones, the tears of someone who'd finally stood up for themselves after years of being pushed down. Linda called to check in an hour later, and I told her about the phone call and how I'd finally told my parents exactly what I thought of them. She said she was proud of me for standing up to them, that it took strength to set those boundaries, and hearing that validation from an actual parental figure made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy for refusing to help them. Sloane ordered pizza for both of us that evening without asking if I could afford it, just casually saying she was hungry and did I want some, and I accepted because I was starving and grateful, and starting to think maybe I'd gotten lucky with my roommate assignment. We stayed up late talking about nothing important, just normal college stuff like classes and clubs and the cute guy's wed scene on campus. And for the first time since the wedding I felt something almost like happiness. I'd made it to college despite everything they'd done to stop me, and that first night in my dorm room felt like the beginning of a life that was finally, completely mine. The peace lasted exactly 2 days before my parents launched what I can only describe as a full-scale harassment campaign, designed to break my resolve and force me back into the role of compliant child who existed to serve family needs. They started by creating new phone numbers to bypass my blocks, sending text messages that ranged from guilt-tripping to outright threatening. My mother's messages said things like, "Your father had a panic attack last night and his blood pressure is dangerously high, and the doctors say stress could kill him, and this is on your conscience now." My father sent messages itemizing supposed debts I owed them from childhood, claiming they'd spent over $200,000 raising me, and I was legally obligated to repay them now that I was an adult. The threats about small claims court felt almost funny given that they'd literally stolen $45,000 from me, but the constant barrage of messages was exhausting and invasive, interrupting my attempts to focus on classes and settling into college life. By day 4, they'd recruited the extended family to join their campaign, and my phone exploded with messages from relatives I barely knew. Aunt Judith sent a long text about how heartless I was being, how my parents were suffering and I had no conscience if I could ignore their pain. Uncle Garrett called me an ungrateful brat in a voicemail that he somehow thought would convince me to help rather than making me more determined to stay away. My cousin Madison sent this essay-length message about family values and how disappointed she was in me, despite the fact that we hadn't spoken in over a year before this. Even worse, somehow members of my parents' church congregation got my number and started contacting me saying they were praying for my hardened heart, that I needed to honor my parents according to scripture, that my selfishness was a sin they were interceding about. The messages made my skin crawl because these people knew nothing about the real situation but had completely bought my parents' victim narrative. Bethany escalated things on day 6 by finding my social media accounts that I'd forgotten to lock down properly in all the chaos of moving. She made a public post tagging me directly, saying some people forget where they came from and my sister refuses to help our struggling parents despite having access to student loans and resources. The post painted me as this cruel, ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her family in their time of need, and it got over 200 likes and dozens of supportive comments from people who believed her version of events. My high school acquaintances started messaging me, asking if it was true, if I was really refusing to help my parents, and I had to decide whether to defend myself publicly or maintain my silence and let people think what they wanted. I chose silence because explaining would require airing all the dirty details of the theft, and I didn't want to give my parents' behavior that much attention or make myself look like I was seeking sympathy. Week 2 brought the nuclear option when my parents showed up on campus unannounced, somehow finding out which dorm I lived in, and waiting in the lobby until I came back from class. I walked into Morrison Hall and saw them standing there looking haggard and desperate, my mother with tear-stained cheeks, and my father with this gaunt, exhausted expression that might have moved me if I didn't know exactly how manipulative they were being. The scene they created was spectacular in its public humiliation, my mother actually dropping to her knees in the middle of the crowded lobby and begging me to please help them. My father started loudly talking about how they'd always loved me, and they were sorry for any misunderstandings, but they desperately needed their daughter right now. Students stopped to stare, some recording on their phones, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment and rage at being put in this position. I called campus security without saying a word to them, and when the officers arrived, I explained that these people were harassing me, and I wanted them removed from campus. My parents tried to tell the security guards that this was a misunderstanding, that they were just trying to talk to their daughter, but I stood firm and insisted they leave immediately. The guards escorted them out while my mother screamed that I'd regret abandoning my family, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that blood was supposed to mean something. The whole dorm witnessed it, and I had to walk past dozens of curious stares to get to my room where Sloane was waiting with obvious concern. She'd seen the whole thing from our window, and instead of asking nosy questions, she just told me about how her aunt had cut off toxic family members years ago, and was much happier for it. That night she introduced me to the campus counseling services, and I made an appointment with Dr. Raymond Booker for the following week. The harassment intensified after the campus incident, like my refusal to engage had made them even more desperate. My parents contacted the University Financial Aid Office, claiming I'd stolen family money and shouldn't be eligible for student aid, trying to sabotage my education since they couldn't guilt me into helping them. The financial aid director, Miss Antonia Cross, called me into her office looking concerned, and I brought all my documentation, including bank statements showing the theft and a legal summary that Linda had written up for me. Miss Cross listened to everything, and her expression went from concern to fury on my behalf, and she put a note in my file that family contact was not authorized, and any future attempts to interfere with my education would be reported to campus police. Having an authority figure validate that my parents were in the wrong felt incredible after weeks of being told I was the problem. An unexpected ally emerged when a woman named Vivian Hart contacted me through Facebook, introducing herself as my grandmother Dorothy's closest friend. Vivian said she'd heard about what my parents had done, and she wanted me to know that Dorothy had specifically structured her inheritance to protect it from them, that she'd tried to contest their access when I was 17, but had died before she could complete the legal changes. Vivian shared stories about how worried Dorothy had been that my parents favored Bethany, how she'd told Vivian many times that she was concerned about my future, and wanted to make sure I had resources they couldn't touch. Learning that my grandmother had seen the favoritism and tried to protect me made me cry for hours, grieving all over again for the one family member who'd actually loved me unconditionally. Vivian offered to write a statement supporting me if I ever needed legal documentation of the family dynamics, and I accepted gratefully, filing it away as ammunition I hoped I'd never have to use. The breaking point of the harassment came when my parents hired some kind of family mediator, probably from an ad in the back of a magazine, who contacted me claiming he could help resolve our conflict. I agreed to one phone mediation session, thinking maybe a neutral third party could make them see reason, but within 5 minutes it became clear the mediator had been paid to take their side. The session revealed that my parents still believed they were entitled to my help, that they showed zero acknowledgement of having done anything wrong, and that they expected me to apologize for causing problems and then provide financial assistance. The mediator actually suggested I was being unreasonable by holding a grudge over money, and my father said they'd be willing to forgive me if I helped them now. I told them all that I'd pursue a restraining order if the harassment didn't stop immediately, and I terminated the session without waiting for their responses. That night I slept with my phone turned completely off for the first time in weeks, and the silence felt like freedom. 2 months into college, information started trickling back to me about how spectacularly my parents' lives were falling apart, and I won't pretend I didn't feel a certain satisfaction watching karma work its magic. My cousin Madison, apparently feeling guilty about her earlier harsh messages, started secretly updating me about the family situation, even though I never asked for the information. She told me things were much worse than my parents had admitted during that desperate phone call, that the house was in pre-foreclosure, with the bank already scheduling auction dates. My father's job performance had deteriorated so badly from the stress that he was on formal probation at work, one mistake away from being fired. My mother had been cut to part-time hours at the clinic because her health issues from stress made her unreliable, and she was dealing with high blood pressure and anxiety that required expensive medications they could barely afford. Their credit score had been destroyed, to the point where they couldn't even get approved for a debt consolidation loan, and Madison estimated their total debt at around $78,000 when you counted everything. Harper, still living in our hometown, provided updates about Bethany and Trevor that were almost poetic in their justice. Apparently, the perfect couple was fighting constantly, their marriage already showing cracks just months after the expensive wedding. Bethany had never sent thank you notes to wedding guests because she couldn't afford the stamps and nice stationery, which had caused gossip and offense throughout the community. The honeymoon to Bali had been canceled because they had no money, and instead of the romantic getaway Bethany had planned, she'd spent her first weeks of marriage in Trevor's parents' basement, where they'd been forced to move. Trevor's finance job had turned out to be just a sales position selling insurance, and had recently been fired for not meeting quotas. Bethany was working retail at the mall, something she'd always said was beneath her, and Harper reported she looked miserable every time anyone saw her at the discount clothing store, where she folded shirts for minimum wage. The domino effect of their poor decisions was satisfying to watch from a distance. My parents had begged Bethany and Trevor for financial help, only to be told that the young couple had their own problems and couldn't spare anything. Bethany had refused to get a second job because she claimed she wasn't cut out for that kind of work, apparently still believing she deserved better despite having zero qualifications or work ethic. Trevor's parents, who'd initially seemed charmed by Bethany, now refused to help her parents after seeing what a disaster their son's marriage had become. The church friends who had sent me those condemning messages had gradually distanced themselves from my parents as the truth about the financial situation emerged, because nobody wants to be associated with people who are publicly failing. Slowly, word got around the community about what my parents had actually done, stealing from their own daughter to fund an excessive wedding, and the sympathy they'd initially received evaporated as people realized they'd been lied to about my supposed volunteer contribution. Aunt Judith had a complete reversal after talking with Vivian Hart, who apparently gave her the full, unvarnished truth about what my parents had done. Judith called me crying and apologizing, saying she hadn't known they'd lied to everyone, that she'd genuinely believed it offered the money, and then cruelly demanded it back. She said other relatives were starting to learn the truth too, and the family was slowly turning against my parents and Bethany as the depth of their manipulation became clear. I accepted Judith's apology but kept her at arm's length because I didn't need family members who'd condemn me without hearing my side first. The begging from my parents escalated into truly desperate territory when they created a fake email address, pretending to be a lawyer, offering me a settlement if it'd just resume contact, but I forwarded it to Linda, who confirmed it was fraud and documented everything in case we needed to pursue legal action against them later. By month 3 of my first semester, Madison reported that my parents had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the kind where you liquidate everything and start over. The house went into official foreclosure and they had to move into a tiny apartment in the worst part of town, the kind of place they used to drive past and make judgmental comments about. My father's car got repossessed, forcing him to take the bus to work, which he apparently found deeply humiliating. My mother's health continued declining, with her high blood pressure becoming a serious medical concern that required expensive treatment they could barely afford, even with her clinic employee discount. Through all of it, Madison said, they continued to blame me to anyone who would listen, telling people that if I'd just helped them everything would be fine, that I was a selfish daughter who'd abandoned her family out of spite. Bethany had her own meltdown on social media, creating a new Instagram account specifically to bypass my blocks and send me direct messages. The messages were unhinged and desperate, saying this is your fault, and if you just helped none of this would have happened, and mom and dad are sick because of you. She said she hoped I was happy ruining the family, that I was a terrible sister and a terrible person and she wished I'd never been born. I screenshot every message for documentation but didn't respond to any of them, because engaging would only feed her victim narrative and give her ammunition to use against me. The truth was spreading, despite their attempts to control the narrative, helped along by Vivian Hart, who wrote an op-ed in the hometown newspaper titled, "When Family Means Exploitation." The piece didn't name names, but everyone local knew exactly who she was writing about, and community opinion shifted massively in the wake of that article. Meanwhile, my own life was thriving in ways that felt almost miraculous given where I'd started. I made Dean's List my first semester with a 3.9 GPA, proving that I could excel academically even while working a part-time job in the campus library to cover expenses. I'd built a friend group with Sloan and 2 other girls from my dorm floor, Jasmine Yu and Kelsey Bradford, who were funny and kind and completely uninterested in drama. I'd joined the debate team and was already being considered for varsity competitions, despite being a freshman. I'd even started dating a guy named Miles Crawford, who was an engineering major, kind and respectful, and nothing like the toxic men my sister had always chosen. My life was becoming something beautiful, and entirely mine. built from nothing but my own determination and the support of people who actually cared about me. Thanksgiving approached and brought one final plea from my mother. A handwritten letter delivered through Madison because I'd blocked every other form of contact. The letter said they were sorry for everything and please come home for Thanksgiving, because they missed me and they'd do anything to make things right with me. I read it carefully, looking for any sign of real accountability, any acknowledgement of what they'd actually done wrong, but found nothing except vague apologies and requests for reconciliation without changed behavior. There was no mention of repaying the money, no admission of theft, no recognition that they destroyed my trust and my financial security for a party. I wrote a response that I sent back through Madison, listing specific conditions for reconciliation, including full repayment with interest, public admission of what they'd done, mandatory family therapy for at least a year, and a formal written apology acknowledging specific harms. I knew they'd never meet those conditions, but setting clear boundaries felt important for my own healing. Their reaction to my conditions was exactly what I'd expected. My father called them unreasonable and said I was asking for the impossible, just to be cruel. My mother said they couldn't afford therapy, and why was I being so difficult when they were trying to make peace? Bethany jumped in to say that my demands proved I didn't really want to reconcile, that I was just looking for excuses to stay angry and keep playing the victim. Every response proved my point, that they hadn't changed at all, that they still saw themselves as the wronged parties, and me as the ungrateful child who owed them obedience and support. I spent Thanksgiving with Sloane's family at their beautiful house upstate, being welcomed and fed and treated like I mattered, and I didn't spare a single thought for the family dinner I was missing back in Ohio. 6 months into college during spring semester, I barely recognized the person I'd become, compared to the scared, desperate girl who'd arrived on campus, with one suitcase and crushing debt. Physically, I was healthier than I'd been in years, having gained back the weight I'd lost during that brutal summer and started working out regularly at the campus gym. Mentally, I was stronger too, with weekly therapy sessions helping me process the trauma and understand that I'd been scapegoated from childhood, that my parents' financial irresponsibility and favoritism weren't my fault or my responsibility to fix. Academically, I was excelling with a 3.9 GPA, and professors who'd started treating me as a serious student worth mentoring. Socially, I had real friends, a healthy relationship, and a support system that actually showed up when I needed them. Financially, I was stable with my work-study job and a summer internship already lined up at a nonprofit that paid decent wages. The anxiety that used to wake me up at 3 a.m. checking my phone for family drama had faded to almost nothing. Dr. Booker, my campus therapist, helped me understand concepts that changed how I saw my entire childhood. He explained scapegoating and how families sometimes designate one child to carry all the blame and problems so everyone else can feel better about themselves. He taught me that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty but self-care, that I could grieve the family I deserved while accepting the reality of the family I had. In one session, he had me write a letter to my younger self, and I found myself crying while writing. "I'm sorry they failed you. I'm sorry you had to be strong so early, but I promise I'll take care of us now." That letter felt like closing a chapter, like the traumatized kid I'd been could finally rest because the adult I was becoming would protect us both. Spring break brought an unexpected encounter when I visited Harper and ran into Bethany at the grocery store. The first time I'd seen her in person since the wedding reception bathroom incident. She looked exhausted in a way that expensive makeup couldn't hide, her roots showing badly, and her clothes clearly cheap fast fashion, instead of the designer brands she used to prefer. I noticed immediately that her wedding ring was gone, the tan line still visible on her finger like a ghost of the marriage that had already failed. We made awkward eye contact across the produce section, and I considered just leaving, but she approached me with this strange defeated expression that I'd never seen on her face before. She said I looked good, but her tone was bitter, and when I asked politely how she was doing, she actually broke down right there in front of the organic lettuce. Bethany told me that she and Trevor had separated, that she was back living with our parents in their tiny apartment, that everything had fallen apart in ways she'd never imagined possible. For a moment, I felt genuine pity for her because despite everything, she was still my sister and seeing her broken was hard. But then I remembered her standing in that bathroom at her wedding, telling me I should thank her for stealing my future, remembered the slap I'd given her, and the complete lack of remorse she'd shown for her part in destroying my life. She asked me if I'd been right, if she should have had a smaller wedding, and I could hear in her voice that she wanted me to absolve her, to say it wasn't her fault, and she couldn't have known. I told her the truth, that the wedding size wasn't the problem, the theft was the problem, The lying and manipulation and complete disregard for my future was the problem. She still couldn't admit real wrongdoing, just said they'd wanted one perfect day, and I told her she'd gotten it and I hoped it had been worth everything it cost. Then I walked away and left her standing there, because I didn't owe her comfort or absolution or anything at all. I talked to Linda about the encounter, and she shared wisdom that stuck with me, saying hurt people, and my parents had raised Bethany to be entitled, and now she was suffering the consequences of lessons they'd taught her. Linda said I could feel compassion without accepting abuse, that the best revenge wasn't revenge at all but freedom from the people who'd tried to keep me small. That conversation helped me understand that I didn't have to hate Bethany or my parents to protect myself from them, that I could acknowledge they were flawed, damaged people, while still maintaining firm boundaries. I was building a new definition of family that had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with who actually showed up when it mattered, who supported my dreams instead of stealing them, who loved me for who I was instead of what I could provide. My found family expanded in beautiful ways that first year. Sloane invited me to her family's beach vacation that summer, treating me like a sister instead of just a roommate. Miles' parents wanted to meet me and treated me with more warmth and interest in one dinner than my own parents had shown in 20 years. Harper and Linda celebrated my birthday with a surprise party, making me a cake and giving me thoughtful presents while my biological family didn't even send a text message. Professor Lucinda Morgan, who taught my social work foundations class, became a mentor and wrote me a recommendation letter for a competitive scholarship that I actually won. I discovered that family isn't about who shares your DNA, but about who shows up consistently, who celebrates your victories and supports you through struggles, who sees your value and wants you to succeed. 1 year into college, at the start of sophomore year, I had to finally accept that my parents would never change. They'd never repaid a single dollar of what they'd stolen, never attended therapy, never given a real apology that acknowledged specific harms, instead of vague regrets about misunderstandings. They sent a generic Christmas card that said, "Wish things were different with love, Mom and Dad," and I threw it away without feeling anything except maybe mild irritation that they'd found my campus address. Madison continued sending updates that I didn't ask for but read anyway, reporting that our parents were still struggling financially, that my father had changed jobs twice and was making less money each time, that my mother's health issues were ongoing and expensive. Bethany had officially divorced Trevor and was working 2 retail jobs while living indefinitely with our parents, in what was supposed to be temporary housing 2 years ago. All 3 of them still blamed me publicly, according to Madison, but the community had stopped believing their victim narrative and mostly just pitied them for the mess they'd made of their lives. My own success continued in ways that felt almost unreal, compared to where I'd started. I declared a major in social work, specifically wanting to help others escape family trauma and financial abuse. I got a summer internship at a family advocacy nonprofit that paid well and gave me real experience in the field I wanted to pursue. I wrote a scholarship essay about my experience that went viral when the Scholarship Foundation published it on their website, and suddenly I was being invited to speak at conferences about financial abuse in families. I published an article in the student journal titled, "When Family Steals Your Future," and the response was overwhelming, with dozens of students reaching out to say they'd experienced similar situations. I was using my pain for purpose, transforming trauma into advocacy, and it felt powerful in a way that simple revenge never could have achieved. The final contact from my parents came at the end of sophomore year through an email I'd forgotten to block. The subject line said, "I'm sorry," and I stared at it for a long time before opening it, part of me hoping this might finally be the real accountability I'd been waiting for. The body of the email was 3 paragraphs that started with self-pity about how hard their lives had become, deflected blame onto circumstances beyond their control, and ended with a half-hearted apology that took no real responsibility. The last line asked, "Can we start over?" and I actually laughed out loud reading it because starting over required acknowledging what had happened, and they still couldn't manage that basic requirement. I showed the email to Miles, Sloane, and Dr. Booker, and all of them said the same thing, that it was my choice whether to respond, but I should be careful about getting pulled back into their dysfunction. I wrote a response and saved it in my drafts folder, pouring out everything I wanted to say. The draft said starting over requires acknowledging what happened. You stole my education fund and chose Bethany's wedding over my future, and taught me that family can be the cruelest betrayers, but you also taught me I'm stronger than I knew. I wrote that I didn't forgive them, that maybe someday I would but not today, that I was building a life they had no place in, and I was finally at peace. After I finished writing it, I read it through twice, felt the catharsis of having expressed everything clearly, and then deleted the draft without sending it. They didn't deserve my words or my energy or any more pieces of my emotional bandwidth. Instead, I blocked their email address and closed that chapter definitively, choosing peace over the temporary satisfaction of telling them off. The final scene of that chapter in my life happened on a random Tuesday afternoon during finals week of sophomore year. I was sitting in the campus courtyard studying for an exam with the sun shining warm on my face, completely absorbed in my textbook. Miles appeared with coffee for both of us, kissing my forehead before sitting down to do his own studying. My phone buzzed with a text from Sloan sending me a meme that made me actually laugh out loud. Then Harper called to finalize plans for our summer road trip across the country. Everything felt peaceful and good, and exactly right. My life full of people who chose to be there, and activities that mattered to me. The phone rang again from an unknown number, and old Cassidy would have panicked immediately, thinking it was my parents trying yet another way to reach me. But new Cassidy just let it go to voicemail without even checking who it was, because it was probably spam anyway. I went back to studying with Miles' shoulder warm against mine, and my future spread out ahead of me like a road I'd paved myself from nothing. People ask sometimes if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I'd just given them the money and maintained the family relationship. The answer is always no without hesitation, because they stole $45,000 but gave me something invaluable in return. They showed me exactly who they were, stripped away any illusions I'd had about unconditional parental love, and forced me to become strong enough to build a life without them. I lost a family, but I found myself, discovered reserves of strength and determination I didn't know I possessed, learned that I could survive anything if I refused to give up. In the end, finding myself was the only thing I really needed, because everything else could be built from that foundation of self-knowledge and resilience. I closed my textbook and looked at the photo on my desk, not of my parents or sister but of my chosen family, Harper and Linda, Sloan and Miles, Dr. Morgan and Vivian Hart, all the people who'd shown up when it mattered and loved me for who I was instead of what I could provide. I smiled at that photo and felt genuine happiness, the kind that comes from knowing you've survived something that should have broken you and came out stronger on the other side. My future was entirely mine, earned through blood and sweat, and refusing to let other people's cruelty define my worth. They'd thought taking my money would keep me small and dependent, and forever in their debt. But instead it had set me free from obligations I'd never actually owed, and illusions that had only ever hurt me. The final line of my story wasn't written by them but by me, and it said simply that they thought taking my money would keep me small, but instead it set me free. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have helped your parents despite everything they did, or would you have walked away like I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I really want to know if I made the right choice. If this story resonated with you, or if you've dealt with toxic family dynamics yourself, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming impossible situations. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to protect yourself even from family, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope wherever you are in your own journey, you find the strength to choose yourself and build the life you deserve. Stay strong, set boundaries, and remember that you're not alone.